When Mercedes first tried to create a less expensive Mercedes, they created the very original A-Class. Let's just be frank and say it wasn't terribly attractive. Their next stab was the much more attractive Mercedes-Benz CLA, but it was a little bit rough around the edges. But now we have a second generation CLA and a significantly more attractive Mercedes-Benz A-Class, and these seem to have fixed just about everything that was wrong with their first two attempts. Now that the A-Class is available in America, the CLA is now the second least expensive Mercedes in the lineup, and this requires us to talk about the Mercedes-Benz A-Class because mechanically the CLA and the A are very, very similar. The CLA is a little bit longer, it has a slightly lower roof, and it is slightly sportier in terms of overall theme. We also get slightly more power under the hood. But other than that, the two vehicles are very, very similar. And in fact, if you see both of them on the road, you really have to stare pretty close to really tell the one from the other. Making things a bit more complicated, although this model does have more power than the base version of the A-Class sedan, the CLA 45 and CLA 35 are going to be exactly the same power that we find in the A45 and A35. Both have a distinctively Mercedes look up front, but the CLA is a little bit more aggressive, and this one has been lowered slightly as part of the AMG package that this one has on it. Note that this is not the full AMG model. Those are coming up a little bit later. We do have this very distinctive grille up front. I have to say these little chrome accents are very attractive, and a big, large Mercedes logo right there in the middle. Increasing the confusion just a little bit between the CLA and the A-Class is that very clearly you can see this is a sedan, and it has 4 doors. But you will not find the CLA on the sedan section of the Mercedes website in America. Instead, this is on the coupe side because, of course, Mercedes loves to call their 4-door vehicles without window frames coupes. And, of course, it has a slightly more coupe-like styling than the A-Class sedan. But again, very, very similar even from a side profile. Now, interestingly enough, although both of the vehicles, the CLA and the A, have actual trunks back here, this is a little bit longer. In fact, this is longer than some compact sedans in America in the luxury segment, so you can't really call the CLA a subcompact Mercedes. Instead, this is simply the less expensive alternative to something like a Mercedes-Benz C-Class. Theoretically, the CLA starts a little bit more than the A-Class, about $36,500 or thereabouts, but this model has a ton of options on it. This one has all-wheel drive, which adds about $2,000. And then to that, they have added enough options to bring this particular model up to $54,000. And that means that if you get carried away with options, the CLA is not necessarily going to be the less expensive alternative to a C-Class. Moving to the rear, the CLA definitely borrows some styling elements from the larger 4-door coupe in their lineup, the CLS. We have relatively similar overall styling up here, and we have these little bump outs down here at the bottom of the bumper. These are theoretically to comply with North American bumper regulations, but honestly, a lot of manufacturers get away without these kind of things, and it's the one thing that I think disrupts the lines of the CLA. If you're in Europe, you obviously won't have this little bump because it was designed for a European format license plate, so just us in North America get this little double bump. Regardless of power level, all CLAs in America will have a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine under the hood. We're driving the least powerful of them, 221 horsepower, 258 pound-feet of torque. Definitely a bump over the last generation CLA, and all that torque is available from 1,800 to 4,000 RPM. According to Mercedes, that's enough to get this vehicle from 0 to 60 in 6.2 seconds, which is pretty close to a C300 because this is about 500 pounds lighter than that rear-wheel drive Mercedes. If that's not enough power for you, there are 2 different AMG versions and something very similar to what we see in the rest of Mercedes' lineup because one AMG simply wasn't enough. The first is an AMG 35, and that will produce 302 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. Although it is worth noting that that torque happens at much higher RPMs, 3,000 to 4,000 RPM, and we have a more aggressive drive ratio in the 7-speed dual-clutch transmission that is essentially the same one that we find under this hood, and that gives us a 0 to 60 time of 4.8 seconds. Then we have an all-new CLA 45 AMG that dials things up to the next level with a brand new 8-speed dual-clutch transmission, 382 horsepower and 354 pound-feet of torque, and according to Mercedes, thanks to all that power and a new 7,200 RPM redline, that will take this 0 to 60 in 4 seconds flat. As you'd expect out of performance vehicles, all-wheel drive is standard on the AMG forms. It's optional on the base engine, but it's definitely an option that I would select. Overall front seat comfort is good. We have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support here, multi-way power driver seat over there on the door. One thing you'll really notice versus the more classic Mercedes sedans is that the seating position is definitely closer to the ground, and of course it's definitely a little bit more reclined than something like the Mercedes C300. Overall seating position is basically the same as the A-Class, although we don't have quite the same kind of headroom figures because the roof is a little bit lower in this model. And then the model that we're driving here has a suspension lowering package, making everything that much closer to the ground. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, but it is manual, not powered like we find in other Mercedes models. Because of the overall size of the CLA and of course the reclined seating position, we don't have as much legroom back here as we find in some of the larger front-wheel drive entries like a Volvo S60 that you might want to compare this against. Sitting right behind myself, I have about an inch of legroom left, but I really can't squeeze these shoes in the footwell. The footwell is just a little bit too tight. This other front seat was adjusted for a 6'5" passenger. There's only about 2 inches of room between the seat back and the rear seat itself, so there's no way I could actually squeeze over there. If I put my head back to this headrest, I do have to crane my head to one side. Overall headroom is a little bit lower back here than the A-Class, but that's not too different, honestly, than some of the other compact sedans that are theoretically one category above this. You won't necessarily find that much more rear seat headroom in something like an Alfa Romeo Giulia, for instance. Now, one big difference between this and the average compact luxury sedan is going to be overall interior width. It technically has a 5th seat belt back here, but you'd have to be pretty small to sit there in the middle, and the people on either side would have to be pretty small as well. We do have 2 air vents back here and a much higher level of build quality than we found in the first generation CLA. We have soft touch door panels over there on each side rather than hard plastic, but outside the door panel uppers, there's still a decent number of hard plastics in the back. Remember, this is the entry-level Mercedes. On the other hand, a very practical touch back here is this 40-20-40 folding seat back. So rather than a ski pass through, this entire center seat section folds forward. That's going to make it an awful lot easier if you want to put skis, snowboards, or anything long inside the CLA and still have passengers in the rear. Don't worry, there's still a ton of very German engineering cues in here, like this little slot on either side of the rear seat backs. That's so that you can put the seatbelt buckle right in there to hold the seatbelt away from the seat when you tip it forward. Because everybody hates it when the shoulder belt is caught somewhere when the seat is pushed back into position. Although the rear seats are a little bit tighter in the CLA than in the A220, we do have one more practical feature, and that is a much larger trunk, thanks to the overall longer length of the CLA. For a vehicle in this particular size category, when this is competing against something like the Audi A3 or perhaps even an upgraded alternative to the Acura ILX, this is not too bad of a trunk overall. And now that I mentioned an Acura ILX and a Mercedes in the same sentence, it's perhaps time to talk about competition for the CLA a little bit early. The CLA's price tag is not as low as some near luxury entries, like a very small Acura, for instance. This is in fact priced more like mid-level trims of an Acura TLX, a lot closer to something like a Volvo S60 than a Buick. And therefore, in many ways, because of Mercedes' higher price tags on a lot of their models, the CLA has almost become the more natural competitor to base entries of the Audi A4 perhaps. Something like very base entries of even a BMW 3 Series could be competition to the CLA. And then of course, obviously, Mercedes' own C300 is obviously a competitor to this as well, because it's going to be parked right next to this on the Mercedes lot. And of course, it's important to remember that there are a decent number of compact luxury sedans that are actually a little bit smaller on the outside than the CLA. Something like the Lexus IS, the Alfa Romeo Giulia, etc. Those are obviously direct competitors to this as well. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in a CLA 250 with a ton of options. Again, this one has a sticker price of about $54,000. So not everything in here will be found on the base model. Above the driver and front passengers' heads, we have a pretty large moonroof for a small vehicle like this. It doesn't cover the rear seats, but it does go well past the driver and front passengers' heads. And of course, it also opens right up. We have fixed height shoulder belts. This model has fixed height headrests as well and leather upholstery. You can see that we have moderately aggressive bolstering on the seat back and seat bottom cushions, and this model does have manually extending thigh cushions as well. If you felt the interior in the previous generation CLA was a little bit below par for a Mercedes, then this generation is likely going to change your mind. We have a lot of the same things going on in here that we find in much more expensive models. You'll find the seat controls over there on the door. This model has 3 memory settings right there for the passenger. You can see the heated seat controls. and the ambient lighting strips. This has the same multicolor ambient lighting that we find in a variety of different Mercedes models. There are different color wheel modes, there are also some static modes, and you can see right here that we even have a light strip on either side of this real wood trim insert. The wood trim is optional. These air vents are very similar to what we see in other Mercedes models. We have stitched upper sections of the dash right there. Everything going on here is soft touch material. We have a slot style glove compartment on the passenger side. I was not able to fit a large tablet computer inside. We do find harder plastics down lower on the dashboard and of course on the doors, just as you'd expect in a less expensive vehicle. Now as we move on over to the middle of the dashboard, we find one of the features that I do wish was standard but is in fact optional, and that is this dual screen LCD instrument cluster and navigation system. The dual screen setup makes this interior feel very much like the more expensive models in the Mercedes lineup, but like most of the new Mercedes, for some reason Apple CarPlay and Android Auto only operate in this very center section of this center 10.25 inch display. The displays are a little bit smaller than the rest of the Mercedes lineup, but they definitely feel big in this interior. Below that we have air vents that also color change. You can see they're purple at the moment, and they operate very similarly to the rest of the Mercedes lineup in America, where you rotate them around to open and close them. Below that we have dual zone automatic climate controls, again themed very much like the rest of the Mercedes lineup. Everything in here has a very consistent and very premium feel. We have a storage cubby there, no lid going on, a single USB-C input for the infotainment system. I wish that was tucked away somewhere. There's a 12-volt power port right there, and then we have cup holders right here on either side with little dividers. I was able to fit large drinks inside. That's one improvement that we've seen in here versus the last CLA. The cup holders have gotten a little bit better. We have the latest touch controller from Mercedes, again very similar to their more expensive models. Home button over there, track forward, backward slider, back button there, some direct access buttons to different features in the vehicle, a favorite button, car settings, the 360-degree camera system that this particular model has on it. There's a drive mode selector toggle that allows us to choose between individual, sport, comfort, and eco, and then some direct access controls over there on the right side. There's a power and volume knob for the infotainment system there, and then behind all of that we have a small wrist rest. The center console opens in two parts right there. It is a softly padded console, but we do have a hard plastic section right there in front. This is a pretty large area overall. We have two additional USB ports in there, but they're charge only. The screens may be smaller, but the software that runs them is essentially the same as the rest of the Mercedes lineup. So we have a highly configurable display, we have some full screen modes, we have some minimalist modes available. The animations are very bright and easy to read. Each side is definitely highly configurable. You can choose between a number of different looks. We have a number of different screens that can be shown in each of these modules. For instance, we have our consumption there. You can even get a moving map display in here as well. The screens are controlled via this BlackBerry style controller on the steering wheel. We have one on the left for this screen and then one on the right for the infotainment screen. You can flick left, right, up, down, click to enter, and then there's a back and home button. The steering wheel itself is a flat bottom 3-spoke design. You can see we have perforated leather sections on each side, some pretty aggressive sport grips up top. There are also paddle shifters on the back, down on the left, and then up over here on the right. The bottom spoke is a split spoke. You find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control over here on the left side, and then controls for the infotainment system over here on the right, along with the touch controller for that infotainment system right there as well. If I rotate the steering wheel out of the way, you'll notice one of the reasons we have so much room there in the center console, and that is this column shifter. We see that in a ton of different Mercedes models, and although some people think it looks a little bit funny, it really does save an awful lot of room in the center console. When you get the CLA 250 out on the road, you're certainly going to notice the refinement in this 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. It is significantly smoother than the first generation CLA. However, it is still a dual-clutch transmission, and that means that at its heart, it's a manual transmission that's being shifted by robot. That's important to understand, because this is never going to be as smooth in slow-and-go traffic or stop-and-go traffic as something like the Mercedes C300, which uses a traditional automatic transmission. And that is one important thing to keep in mind. I know a lot of people out there that bought a first generation CLA and weren't too happy with the transmission feel until you let them know that that's exactly what's going on under the hood, and I think that knowing that helps people feel a little bit better about their vehicle rather than thinking that there's something wrong. Obviously, there are two big reasons that Mercedes has stuck with the DCT under the hood, and the first one is overall performance. It really helps improve acceleration, and this model will go 0 to 60 in 6.2 seconds. That matched exactly what Mercedes claims this vehicle can do. The second reason, of course, is fuel economy. Dual-clutch transmissions are more efficient than automatic transmissions because we don't have a torque converter. Instead, we have the clutch pack, and the overall gear set design inside dual-clutch transmissions is also a little bit more efficient. Although the model that we're driving has a number of AMG accessories on it, This particular vehicle does not have wider tires, so we have 225 width tires all the way around. Wider tires are available in the actual AMG trims, the AMG 35 and AMG 45. But even so, this had a very impressive stopping distance, just 112 feet from 60 miles an hour to 0. And that's because this is significantly lighter than a C300. The light curb weight is directly responsible for the fast acceleration, the short braking distances, and the excellent handling. The CLA 250 is an awful lot of fun to drive. And remember that if you get the CLA 35 and 45, it's just going to become even more fun. Now, obviously, if you start driving it harder and you floor it, it does start to feel like a front-wheel drive vehicle. You can get the front end pushing out just a little bit, but the all-wheel drive system and overall suspension design really keeps that in check. One of the things that I really love about the CLA is the way that Mercedes has decided to position it. They've made it a smaller Mercedes, but not necessarily a less equipped Mercedes. So you can still get AMG versions that are an awful lot of fun. You can still get all the same sort of accessories and features and functions that you'd expect out of a larger Mercedes model. Now, obviously, not everything that's available in an S-Class is going to be available in the CLA, but a surprising amount of Mercedes gadgets and gizmos are. And that's not something that a lot of manufacturers do. Even if we're talking about the next category up where the Mercedes-Benz C-Class plays, not every manufacturer out there will allow you to buy the same kind of options and features that you'd expect in a mid-size or a full-size luxury sedan. But Mercedes seems to offer a wide number of gadgets and gizmos in all of their lineup. We'll talk about this more in a bit, but in basic terms, that means that you could get something like a CLA 35 AMG for the price tag of a moderately well-equipped C300. And that's an incredible deal in my mind, because this handles absolutely excellently. I'm going to give this an A when it comes to overall handling. And bear in mind again that this does compete with entry-level, even rear-wheel drive options from the competition. One of the CLA's available features that we do not have on this model is the optional adaptive suspension. And I think that is something that I would get with this particular car, because otherwise the CLA can feel just a little bit firm out on some road surfaces, especially if you end up with the model that has the lowering package that we're driving right here. This is pretty firm for an entry-level luxury vehicle. This is definitely going to be firmer than something like an Audi A3 in most versions, unless of course we're talking about the more sporty versions, and definitely more firm than subcompact vehicles out there like the Volvo S60 or the Acura TLX, or vehicles in that particular segment. Now, something like an Alfa Romeo Giulia is, I think, a little bit more fun than this, but the difference is not enormous, and I kind of actually like the way that this feels out on the road. Again, it feels lighter, it feels more nimble than many of those vehicles that are a little bit larger. This is, remember, at least 500 pounds lighter than most of them. At 50 miles an hour, we measured 71.5 decibels in this cabin. That appears to make this a little bit quieter than the first generation CLA that we last tested, and honestly pretty similar to something like a Volvo S60 or the Acura TLX. Now, out on rougher roads, this does have a little bit more road noise in the cabin than I would like, and that is something that will affect your daily commute if you drive out on a rougher road surface. And that surprised me a little bit because we don't have the wider tires in here. I'm eager to see what the AMG versions of the CLA are like, because with their wider tires, that may increase the cabin noise even more. When it comes to fuel economy, I'm going to give this a B. We have been averaging just above the EPA numbers, 27.9 miles per gallon in this all-wheel drive model. But the reason I'm going to give this a B and not an A is because we do have larger vehicles in this segment that give us very similar overall fuel economy. And of course, if you want even better fuel economy, there are a few hybrids available. And oddly enough, you could also compare this to something like a Volvo S60 T8 hybrid, which is going to get you 27 miles per gallon and have 400 horsepower, definitely quicker than this particular model. I don't think it's going to be as much fun. It's certainly not going to have the overall driving dynamics of this, but it is going to give you an awful lot of power and, not surprisingly enough, be that much more expensive than the model that we're testing here. Pretty soon, Mercedes will have a boatload of new 2020 and 2021 entry-level vehicles to choose from the CLA 250 that we were driving today to the A220, the new GLB 250, and of course the upcoming refreshed GLA as well. All four of these models are going to fill out the bottom end of the Mercedes envelope, and they've really started slicing their sausage pretty thinly here. Theoretically, the CLA is for someone that wants a slightly sportier look and is willing to give up a little bit of the practicality that we find in the A220, and of course, for someone that wants just a little bit more power. Now, the odd part about that is that once you move up to the CLA 35 AMG or the A35 AMG, then they have the same amount of power. And then beyond that, the CLA 45 and A45 also have the same amount of power. But we're here to talk about the CLA 250, and for this model you will have to pay for the extra style because it is more expensive. It starts at $36,650. That is significantly more expensive than where the CLA started just 6 years ago, back in 2014 when the first model launched. That started just under $30,000. But it's easy to see what Mercedes is doing here when you take a look at the CLA lineup right now, because if you go to a Mercedes dealer at this moment, you'll still see the old CLA 45 AMG on the lot. And you can see that the interior really is much more premium in the brand new model. And the styling is definitely a scaled down version of what we see in the CLS and of course the Mercedes-Benz S-Class. They've decided really to make just scale versions of their vehicles across the lineup. And that's a look that I really don't mind. I think it really dresses the CLA up an awful lot, but it also means that it's a more premium product and therefore much more expensive. If you want the CLA 35 AMG, that's going to start just under $47,000. We don't know how much the new CLA 45 AMG is going to be just yet, but expect it to be over $55,000. It could even push $60,000 once it is finally released. That means that it may be very similar, if not, oddly enough, more expensive than the C43 AMG. This makes competition honestly very, very tricky, because I personally think that a lot of the competition for the CLA is really just going to come from other Mercedes models on the dealer lot. The model that we were driving today was $54,110 after destination. That is significantly above its starting price, and it was relatively easy to get there if you get carried away with options that I think a lot of people are going to want. Things like the adaptive suspension, the extra safety systems, the nicer leather interiors, etc. I think those are very easy option boxes to check, and they will rapidly get you up there to about $55,000 or so. And that means that the model that we were driving was more expensive than a base C-Class, and more surprising than that, more expensive even than a Mercedes E-Class base. So in some ways, Mercedes is simply giving you the option. Would you like the slightly smaller front-wheel drive option with more things on it? Or would you take something like a Mercedes-Benz E-Class, which is the more classic Mercedes, but obviously with no additional bells and whistles? But more on that in a little bit. Let's talk about the competition first. Obviously, we have the Audi A3, the original front-wheel drive entry for America in this particular segment. Now, at the moment, the A3 lineup has shrunk a little bit in America because we are expecting a new generation of A3 coming very soon. So at the moment, the A3 is honestly outclassed in pretty much every way by the CLA, just because the A is so old at this point in time. The important thing to remember about the A3 is that as the oldest entry in this segment, it is truly going to be outclassed in most ways by the more modern entries like the BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe or the Mercedes CLA. That said, however, I really, really love the A3 Cabrio. I've always loved the proportions, the interior room, the feature set, and the price tag as well. Very sadly, the A3 Cabrio is dead for 2020 in America, however. Now, as you'd expect from Audi, the A3 is less expensive. We get more feature content in the base model, and it starts at $33,300. It also has a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission, but I do think that the Audi DCT is a little bit smoother than what we find in the Mercedes. Mercedes has made significant refinements to the DCT that we find in the CLA for 2020, but it's still not going to be as smooth as what we find in the Audi. Just how good of a value is the Audi A3? Well, for the price tag of the CLA 250 as we were driving it this week, you could nearly have bought a brand new 2020 Audi RS3 that would certainly have been a significant amount more fun. But again, the Audi is not going to be quite as fresh, quite as modern, and I do like the overall look that we have in the Mercedes, just a hair better. I think the A3 has aged incredibly well. I still think that the overall proportions are some of the best in the Audi lineup, but it is unquestionably getting a little bit old. Certainly not old is the somewhat controversial BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe. The 2 Series Grand Coupe has absolutely no relationship with the other 2 Series models that you can still buy in the US. Those are rear-wheel drive vehicles. The 2 Series Grand Coupe really is a Mini Cooper with a BMW body on top. Now, that shouldn't surprise anybody because BMW has, of course, been making front-wheel drive vehicles under the BMW brand for a while in Europe. They were just a little bit hesitant to bring them to the US until now, clearly because Mercedes and Audi have succeeded with their front-wheel drive options. But it appears that BMW isn't totally willing to go completely front-wheel drive just yet, so the 2 Series Grand Coupe comes standard with all-wheel drive, a 220 horsepower 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, and most importantly, a traditional 8-speed automatic transmission made by Aisin. The BMW and Mercedes are pretty similar when it comes to overall weight, tire size, and both manufacturers are for some reason calling their 4-door sedans coupes. As we've come to expect from BMW, the price tag is a little bit lower than the Mercedes, and that value proposition continues as you start adding options to the 2 Series Grand Coupe. I have to admit that I'm a little bit torn on these two options. Initially in my head, I was thinking I might like the BMW 2 Series a little bit more. Generally speaking, BMW's interior designs and iDrive have spoken to me a little bit more than some of the Mercedes options, but I have to say I might pick the CLA 250 over the 2 Series Grand Coupe. Part of this is styling. I think the CLA wears the Mercedes sheet metal an awful lot better, and even though the overall styling is pretty similar to the larger Mercedes models, when they shrink it down for the CLA, it actually seems to work. And on the BMW 2 Series, from a lot of angles, it looks a little like little brother wearing big brother's clothes from some angles. Now, I do like the iDrive software better in the BMW, but the Mercedes screens, especially the instrument cluster, I think is definitely ahead of what we see in the BMW. And in kind of an odd reversal, the BMW is the slightly more relaxed model. The 8-speed automatic transmission is more refined, more polished. It feels perhaps a little bit more comfortable than the Mercedes, but the Mercedes, I think, would be my choice among these two vehicles. I would be willing to pay a little bit more for the Mercedes, and it's worth noting that even though the BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe is a better value overall than the CLA, it's not necessarily that much cheaper. You really can get your BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe up to about $50,000 as well. Our last competitor is, I think, the trickiest one here, and some of this could be applied to a variety of other options in the luxury segment. Here's the thing in my head. If you've decided to get a CLA or an A, then you've theoretically already given up BMW and Mercedes rear-wheel drive driving dynamics, and therefore you could start looking at a competitor like the Volvo S60. Because the Volvo S60 is front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, and in terms of overall driving dynamics, it really is very similar to the BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe and the Mercedes CLA and A-Class. The Volvo S60 is not going to be as sharp, not going to be quite as much fun as a BMW 3 Series or a Mercedes-Benz C-Class in their rear-wheel drive variants, but when we're talking about the next line down, then honestly, there's not that much difference. And the Volvo has a lot going for it. Being a more value-oriented option in that next category up puts it right in the thick of things in terms of overall price tag for the CLA. Starting price is not that far off. Interestingly enough, they're really not that far off in terms of overall size either. Even though the CLA is theoretically a subcompact entry, the way that they've stretched it and poked it and prodded it for 2020, it's only 2 inches shorter than the Volvo. And the Volvo puts almost all that room right back into interior space. So the rear seat area especially is an awful lot roomier than what we find in the Mercedes. It's also worth noting that we find a few options available in the S60 that are not available in the CLA, like the massaging seats. When it comes to gadgets, the two vehicles are pretty equally matched as well. The Mercedes does have a large LCD instrument cluster and then a matching infotainment system right next to it, which I really think looks pretty snazzy. The Volvo is not too far behind. It has a full LCD instrument cluster and then a slightly smaller touchscreen infotainment system right in the middle of the dashboard. But I do like the overall look and the overall design. The Volvo has something else up its sleeve: more power and better acceleration. In this comparison, the Mercedes goes 0 to 60 in 6.2 seconds, the Volvo a second faster in 5.2 seconds, and it uses a smoother 8-speed automatic transmission. Interestingly enough, the same 8-speed automatic that we find under the hood of the BMW. When it comes to overall handling, the two vehicles are really not that far off. The Volvo has wider tires, but it's 500 pounds heavier, and as a result, the Mercedes feels an awful lot lighter, an awful lot more nimble, definitely more fun, more perky out on the road. But when it comes to absolute handling grip numbers, the two vehicles are not that far off, and again, when it comes to overall driving dynamics, they're really not far off either, because neither one of these vehicles will ever send a majority of engine power to the rear wheels. In this comparison, Volvo's S60, with the inscription package, the T6 engine option, and all-wheel drive, is still going to be right around the same price tag as the model that we were driving. And even if you don't get carried away with options, something like the Volvo S60 T5 is going to be very similar in terms of overall performance to the base CLA 250. And you may even pay a little bit less for all of those options on the Volvo. So when it comes right down to it, my top pick in this segment would actually be, out of this segment, technically, it would be the Volvo S60. I think that's really where the S60 performs very well compared to Mercedes and BMW, because There are logical reasons to buy the 3 Series or the C-Class over the Volvo S60. Overall driving dynamics, the amount of power you can get in some of the up-level versions, etc. But when we're talking about 2 Series Grand Coupe or CLA 250, a lot of those reasons to go for the German option just aren't there, and instead you could get the slightly larger and definitely more comfortable Volvo. But rewinding here for a little bit, I again think that the most direct competition for the CLA is sitting right there on the Mercedes lot. If you're Mercedes shopping and you're taking a look at a well-equipped C300, you could get an awful lot more stuff without giving up too much in terms of overall performance by getting a CLA 250 instead of the C300. And oddly enough, even though the C300 has those classic rear-wheel drive dynamics, I found the CLA 250 just a little bit more fun. It's so much lighter, it feels more nimble, it feels more chuckable out on a winding mountain road. It's the kind of vehicle that really begs to be driven harder and faster, whereas the C300 is a little bit more relaxed, and that surprised me a little bit. It's also worth noting that this value proposition continues as you work your way on up. So for the price of a C300 well optioned, you could get something like a CLA 35. For the price of a C43 AMG with no options on it, you could probably get a base CLA 45 or even a CLA 45 with a decent number of options, and that is an absolute hoot and a half. Hopefully we will be able to drive the brand new one, but even if it was simply as much fun as the previous generation CLA 45, it's going to be an absolute blast to drive. Be sure and check back because we will have a video on that just as soon as we possibly can. In the meantime, be sure and head over to facebook.com/AlexNautos. Find us at Instagram if you want to see the lighter side of things. You can also check out our related gardening channel. There's a link down there in the description as well, and I'll see all of you next week.